Many people say, where do your titles come from for your books? And I have to admit, it's when I wake up like after a really good sleep and you're kind of like, wait a minute, it all makes sense now. And Howling Winds came to me when I thought I needed to do a story on dogs on shipwrecks. So we're going to talk about mascots on board. And quite honestly, so many of these ships had these mascots. In fact, I was very lucky. In fact, my picture is over here. I should have brought it up. That Al had of him with his kitty cat on board the Frontenac. So very frequently we would have these animals on board just to break up some of the monotony of long trips. The hope is that you would just be carrying cargo port to port and not run into big storms. But it was really nice to have somebody on board that maybe didn't argue with you so much, or take all your money in a poker game. So we see a lot of these mascots were really brought along to do that. This book has also got a major chapter on this guy. This is Dr. Doug Houghton. And for those of you who don't know, he was one of the early medical doctors that came into Detroit, coming in from New York, but he was also a geologist. And when the state figured out that they were dead broke when we became the state of Michigan, they said, we need to go around and figure out all of our resources. So they hired this guy as a geologist to go all around. Now, if you've seen my lecture on the briny depths about all of the salt deposits, you know that this was the guy that started to show that not only in the Grand River by Grand Rapids, but of course in Bay City and Saginaw, where we had one of the nation's largest salt producing companies, at least 40 companies that were along the river that did that. So here's Doug, and here's his wonder dog. This is Mimi. And Mimi went along on so many adventures, and the sad story is that he was lost in an open boat with Houghton. And I don't think I'm surprising anybody with this, but sadly they go for a journey that we'll talk about here, and they don't get back. But the story goes that he came into the river system and actually canoed his way all the way up to Shiawassee through what eventually became Chesaning. He came into Midland, which at the time was an old settlement where Native Americans were, but sadly they had all died from smallpox. So he wrote in his diary, I have to do something about this. And he went around and vaccinated over 2,000 Native Americans with smallpox vaccinations. And back then, it was just a needle that you would poke into a scab of smallpox and put it into the body and inoculate people that way. So it was a pretty incredible procedure, and to see he covered that many people. So stagecoach Royal Oak into Byron, all the way up in a canoe into the Saginaw River. And of course, we had massive flooding, and he's trying to find these salt springs coming up with the swollen Tittabawassee River, and of course the Salt River where it was kind of feeding into. And this is in 1837. So much of his notes actually go into the problems with mosquitoes. When he went to Tawas, his entire notes, and you can find these online. If you look up Douglas Houghton and diaries, you can get a play-by-play of him going around and mapping. These are all his maps. That's not even called Tawas back then. It's Ottawa Bay. And it goes all the way up to now, they call it Fishing Point, but Tawas Point. And you see over here where the Coast Guard station would eventually be built right inside there. He says here, being expressly annoyed by mosquitoes, accompanied by Mr. Douglas as they went up into the river system. So it's pretty interesting to see what the day-to-day was in there. Here's the Keweenaw Peninsula, and sadly this would be the last chapter, really, as he starts to look into the Upper Peninsula. It was his cohorts that came out that took their compass around Negaunee and saw it was spinning around because of the iron ore deposits. So immediately found what would become, purple gold, really, for them. The Chocolate River, which we now call the Chocolate River, named so because the water looked like chocolate. Of course, I can promise you it doesn't taste like chocolate. They were actually coming off of this area before it was even called Marquette. And it was called Carp River back then. And he actually came back into this area around the Keweenaw and started finding this massive boulder of copper that the Native Americans had talked about. And he broke 4 chisels trying to get a piece of that off to bring it back. Then he went to La Pointe, which was a long-time mission for many of the Catholic priests, including the bishop, our snowshoe bishop, who actually went back and forth from La Pointe to, back then the sea was actually in the Sioux. It eventually went to Marquette. And of course the schooner Brewster was his way of getting back. He had to take a canoe to get all the way over here. So the stories are pretty incredible. And what I also noticed in his notes was that he went through all here, and this is the Eagle River. So if you've been up in the Keweenaw Peninsula, he writes down all of the different veins of copper that he finds. And it says right in the front, good copper, and eventually gets down to number 7, which is 3 waterfalls down. And he says, yeah, not very good copper here. I don't think there's anything here. And I thought, that's kind of weird, because his cousin came to build the first copper mine, and he built it near vein 7. So my guess is that maybe he was telling everybody that, and I'm not saying he's a bad guy, right? I'm just saying, why did his cousin come in and start to build the giant complex that actually came out right here? The first time that they actually put a wheel into the river system, the first time they had pulverizers that they could actually break the copper out, and it's 1.3 miles upstream in an area that he said was not good, was his official report that came in. So my suspicion is there. As I went through my notes too, I was able to go down to the Burton collection in Detroit at the library, and this whole note was written down about how Mr. Houghton came in and saw C.C. Douglas. So that's the cousin who's now managing this big mine in Eagle River. And this is the first time that I ever see that he actually came inland. The story was always that he was just delivering some supplies around the Keweenaw. He made, unfortunately the storm was coming in, and he should have, reached shelter. I'll show you on a map where they had a beach area that they could have stopped at. But unfortunately, one of the guys that he was with inside the canoe had to get back, and he had to catch the Algonquin, the schooner, to get back. There's only one ride back to Detroit, so they had to go all the way back. This is before the Soo locks were even built, so they had to go all the way back to the Soo and then get off that boat and find a steamer to go down all the way to the Detroit area. So this is the official letter to Alva Bradish, who we'll also talk about in a second as well. Here's his final run, and we see him leave from Eagle Harbor. He made a stop in Eagle River, and he made it all the way up the river to where he was actually visiting his cousin. Then he came back in, and they had to go to a storehouse to drop off supplies. And apparently one of the guys left some of his equipment there, because they went all the way down, talked to a guy named Hill, and then came back. And this is where the guy said, oh, by the way, I left my gear at this other place. So he's on a hurry to get back. He's stopping to pick up this other equipment. And finally they get in, the winds are picking up, and the one guy in the canoe says, you know what, we should really pull over here. And he goes, no, we've got to get back. We've got to press on. And by the time he gets all the way up to here, it's too late. He's now along cliffs that are right here. Very impossible to try to launch or bring your Mackinac boat in, a simple open sailboat that you would bring in. And Mimi and him and 3 other guys were on there, and as the waves came in, they flipped over the boat, and tragically he was lost. And near that area where they actually found his boots and himself, he had his initials in his boots because it took a year to find him. Thank heavens that he has initials so they could know it was him. He brought his body down to Detroit, and he was buried in the Detroit area. But Mimi kind of gets a little moment here too on the relief there as well. There is one account that I saw that Mimi survives, but no other account from any of the guys. 2 guys make it out of the boat and actually have to walk all the way back to Eagle River, and they say nope, that everybody had been lost but those 2. So another little gem that you get as you go through these handwritten notes was that Bradish wanted not only to write a biography about Houghton, but he wanted to paint his picture. He was very famous for painting the governors of Stevens Mason, and even some of the mucky mucks in Canada too, where he'd make his money painting them. And this guy wrote his note back and said, by the way, this is the hammer that we used right here, and it was heavier, and he made a couple notes in there about the cold chisels. And wouldn't you know it, in the official painting, there's the hammer right there, and Mimi, which is great. It hangs up in Michigan Tech University, very close to where he was lost, and very apropos because this is the Mineral Museum honoring especially these discoveries. The first guy to really talk about gypsum, so our alabaster as you go up US 23, first guy to really bring salt to the marketplace and really take over from Syracuse. And of course the iron ore industry that came out of it, and the copper industry. We basically had a run on copper. Every penny for 3 years had Keweenaw copper in it because of the discoveries that were made here. And only because the government got panicked about using too much Michigan copper did they stop doing that, and it actually ran our industry out. It was considered the best around the lakes. This guy right here, this little doggy, is why I wrote the book. It turns out that I did a story in 2002 called Safe Ashore. And it was all about this vessel that ran ashore in the 1940 Armistice Day storm. And the captain name was Steve, and he had another captain that was with him as a first mate. Well, that captain had run a ship aground about 4 weeks before. And it turns out he told everybody, Dick Simpel said, that I've been on 17 shipwrecks. And I have to ask you, who sails with a guy that's been on 17 shipwrecks? That's absolutely crazy. But it turns out this is Dick right here. He's from Midland, Ontario, and he works his way up from deckhand right to captain. And he is on at least that many shipwrecks for sure. This is in 1917 on the Saskatoon, and it turns out he went on board this boat too. This was originally built as the Huron in Michigan, and it served several years on the Great Lakes and then actually was bought up as a big package deal. It turns out during World War I, we desperately needed coal colliers, so a way to get coal back and forth along the East Coast. So they bought up Mutual Transport Company, 5 of their freighters, and sent them to Noank, yeah, the big shipyard that's near Mystic. And all these ships were lined up, and I sent a note to the museum there, and I said, do you know anything about Great Lakes ships coming here? And they said, not really. And then 3 weeks later, they said, wait a minute, we have a painting of these ships. Are these Great Lakes ships? They didn't know, and they are. So one of these might be the Huron that came in here and actually was converted over for sea use. So the back cabins here would get extra protection from the weather on the back, and I'll show you how they put that on. In fact, you can actually see how they added this entire wall right here above the weather deck on the side, so you didn't have to get pummeled by the ocean as you went to your cabins. On the Great Lakes, those were normally open. So this one's probably the Huron, and it was very problematic at the shipyard. The smokestack fell over and killed a man, hurt 2 others, put them in the hospital. And when they went to launch it, it got hung up. So it's up on the dry dock after being converted, and they go to launch it, and it doesn't launch. So they said it's a hoodoo vessel. It's got a problem. They knew there'd be trouble on this vessel, but it made it all the way through World War I with no issues. And then it came back here, bought up by another company to be taken out in the Matthews fleet. And actually throughout the entire Matthews fleet, it only lasts for a little while. It comes up here, and it's coming through the Sioux Locks, goes off of Whitefish Point, goes past where the Edmund Fitzgerald is, and not too far away, because in about 500 feet of water right here, it's blinding fog. And they said all kinds of smoke was coming off the coastline from forest fires that were going on. And when they got up into this area, they immediately got hit by another vessel. And of all names, it's an interlake boat called the Cetus. Now, if you know your history or your mythology, Cetus is the sea monster, right? So here they get hit with a sea monster on Lake Superior, and immediately the ship is gashed into the side, and the Cetus's captain knows it's pretty bad. So he keeps the power on his ship so that they're wedged together. He's plugging the hole so that all the crew can get off the Huron Ton, which is its new name. They add the T-O-N at the end of the ship from the Huron to the Huron Ton to show it was in the Matthews fleet. So they're from Toronto. That's where the Ton comes. So Burlington, there's several other ships that they had in there as well. So they do that, but as soon as they get everybody on board, Simpel looks around and he goes, where's my bulldog? And they said, and this is a great picture, this is Bob McGreevy's drawing of the 2 ships wedged together, and you can see that it hit just forward of the last hatch on the Huronton. And you can actually see right here, see that weather deck that they covered up with that big piece of metal that goes across? I haven't seen that on any other of the Great Lakes vessels, but because it came back from the ocean, that's probably why it was there. And Bob drew this picture too. Here's our buddy Simpel bringing the bulldog. It had been tied up in the galley, ran him back into the Cetus, and the crew brought him back on, and that's pretty much all they published. Was everybody was saved, it was in thick fog, and the dog was saved by Captain Simpel. So amazing that this is probably Simpel's 3rd shipwreck. He hasn't even gotten to the Novadoc yet, and that entire career continues on. Here he is. I write a letter to the gal in Midland, and I said, is there any chance you've heard of Simpel? She goes, you know, his wife sent me a bunch of pictures. So here's a picture with a bulldog, and I've got to believe it's got to be the one that he was with, but the name is completely gone to history. I don't know what that dog's name, but I'm just going to call him Bulldog. How's that? So fast forward now to us out on a very productive 2023. Daryl Ertel found 12 ships, and he was like joking he was going to make a calendar out of all the ships. You know, every month would have a ship. Nobody finds 12 shipwrecks in a year. He found 14. This is how incredible that year was. This is right after COVID, obviously, and we were able to go up there and do some filming. And they had me come along when they decided to put a robot down on that ship, and it was amazing. Let's take a look. Put this in motion.
Nothing to see in there.
See that right there? That's that covering that we talked about that went over the door. Look at how all the doors are open too. This is everybody escaping from the ship to get on board the Cetus, which would have been wedged just forward of where we're at right here. Immediately when we see these electric lights, we can tell that this is a certain year. It's after, you know, say the 1920s, probably 22, when we really see a lot of electricity on the boats. And then we start to look around here and see this massive tear in the ship. And immediately we know that this is one of two vessels, and because it's electric, we know that this has got to be the Huron. Even though we didn't get lucky, look at that tear.
No,
this is the bow of the Cetus that crashed into this. Many of the other wrecks we found, the Atlanta that was built here in Bay City still had the name. It was in gold letters that said Atlanta. If you watch the special with me on the National Geographic Explorer, we actually found the Selden Marvin and went around the back of the ship, and here's the name hanging there. But on these metal boats, we don't always get that lucky to see a name on there. And even the ship they just found last summer, the Western Reserve, we know by the length, we know the way it crashed that it's the Reserve. But unfortunately, I don't think they've seen anything with a name on it yet that I know of. At least I haven't seen that footage. So Captain Simpel gets off the boat. He looks for his own boat, and sure enough, he gets on board the Novadoc. He's actually with the same captain who was on the Huron with him, and they run ashore in the St. Lawrence Seaway, or the St. Lawrence River. As you go up here, you can see this is the length of the ship, and I measured it against the island, so it's about right, and it's hanging on Frontenac Shoal right here. And it looks right here, you can tell it's not in real rough shape. A very unique design for the Novadoc. It's got a very flat pilot house, which is going to pose problems for his next shipwreck on this boat just a couple of weeks later. But look at how this boat's hung up here, and look at the water depth. It's 100 feet deep right here. So the divers are really nervous as they put people inside this ship to start shoveling the coal out of it to make sure that it can be saved. They're worried that it's going to shift off of that reef and actually sink in deep water here. And thank heavens it doesn't. They actually get the boat off. And of course the captain loses his job because the Patterson steamship does not allow you to sail as captain after you have an accident like this. So they have to reshuffle everybody during the year. And we see that Don Steep gets shuffled over to the Welland-Dock, and we see Summers is on the Novadoc, and then here's Simpel, our guy, who's on the Cartier-Dock. And all of these, they say dock at the end of them. This is another way that the ships would tell what fleet they're from by adding DOC at the end for Dominion of Canada. So that's why they all say dock at the end of it. And then they use the Sioux. They use all of these different either big cities like Toronto or many of the big provinces as well in their names as they name the ships. So our captain goes to this boat and promptly runs that one aground not too far from where it was wrecked. So now he's on Shipwreck 6. And here's his whole note. It's his protest where he actually writes down what happened. He said, it was blinding fog. I ran it aground. And right away, you know, the people at Patterson said, listen, you can't have another boat, at least for a year. So we're going to put you on the Novadoc and we're going to move Captain Steep to it. And so 2 weeks later, they're sailing on Novadoc and they run into this storm. So now he's on shipwreck number 6, and these giant waves are crashing over the Novadoc as they try to get around Little Point Sable. So they're just off of Pentwater, Michigan. What the good news is that sadly they've lost 2 cooks, but 17 of them are still on board this ship. And it turns out that the wheelman who I interviewed for my show was up front here. He said we broke up furniture and put it in a bucket and actually made a little fireplace so we could stay warm. But all of the engineers are back here in the oilers room on the lee side of the storm, but they're in knee-deep water. And the Coast Guard came down. They couldn't find a way to the beach, but everybody in town knew how to get there. They even had cars on the beach. They were flashing their lights. But the Coast Guard saw that they were on the break, you know, on the sandbar here, and they said, well, they're not going to sink anymore. So they turned all of their attention to go to Ludington and where the big car ferry, the city of Flint, had come ashore. So that made sense to do that because they thought there were more people on there than there actually was. But this spot, these guys were out here for 2 days waiting for rescue. The wheelman telling me he took his bed sheet and flew it out the window saying, who's going to come get us? And 2 fishermen were on the beach and they said, we'll go get them. So they went to the Coast Guard and they said, hey, we'll go get those guys. And the Coast Guard bosun looks at him and goes, mind your own business. We'll take care of this. We're the experts. And this all came out in the court case, which was really sad because the guy that was really in charge of all this was a fantastic hero of at least 7 different shipwreck rescues. And it was not his finest day, unfortunately. So November 11th, November 12th, they're waiting for rescue. Finally, the fishermen decide to come out and rescue them. Simpel wanted to swim for it. He told the captain, I'm going to jump in the water, even though his face was all cut from all of the glass breaking out when the waves busted out the pilot house. He says, I can swim for it. And he goes, oh no, you stay in the boat and we'll wait for help. But as the wheelsman says, they unfortunately didn't have a lifeboat.
We knew there wasn't any lifeboats because they were broken. And one went floating right up past us. I was still in the wheelhouse when the starboard lifeboat let go. And it went right up alongside of us, so I thought, oh, it wouldn't be any good to us anyway, so we'd never get back there. And they didn't have floats or anything for, in the bow end.
No raft or anything in the
No,
front?
no.
Wow. What time did you hit? At what time of night was it when you guys went below?
Oh, 11 o'clock at night on November the 11th. And that's when we hit, and then we sat there all the next day, and then we were rescued 36 hours afterwards.
So those fishermen come back out. Here's this is Captain Simpel with his face all cut. Here's the wreck all broken up, and the distance that they would have had to cross if he did try to swim it. But the fishermen come out, bring these guys ashore. The Coast Guard are right behind them. They had been stuck in the mud, and there was all kinds of flack. In fact, my documentary, Safe Ashore, my book, The Wheelsman, that's here, has all of the backstory on a lot of that stuff, which is an entire another lecture. Our buddy Simpel gets on board the Sorrel dock, and Patterson has the big contract to bring all the newsprint into the Tribune in Chicago. So weaving up the river, and you see them right here coming through the bridge. They said, we want you to be the Christmas tree ship. So in 1949, Bob Hope is on the boat with them, and he gets to sail into town and look at 1 million kids greeting Captain Simpel when he gets there, and brings them all in. It's even a TV special of some of the local television talent that were out there as well. Sadly, though, he comes into Milwaukee with another boat, the Saginaw, and has a heart attack. And the Coast Guard comes out and rescues him, put him in a cot to bring them down into the shore. He comes back and they say, you shouldn't sail anymore, Cap. You got to go back. So he made it about 2 more years before he passed away. And then the guy that actually took his job has a heart attack on the same boat in the same harbor and dies just months afterwards as well. So absolutely tragic as you look at the history of what was there. This is a good outcome for a dog. I'll start you with that. This is another bulldog called Tony, and he's stuck on a Bay City built freighter. This is the LC Waldo, which was built right in town here, and it went into the 1913 storm, and unfortunately, Captain Duddleson could not make it through the storm. We see a dry dock picture of them right now, and if anybody's ever seen a picture of a boat in dry dock, you see that it's actually touching the bottom. It should be up on blocks. That's because this bottom was filled with cement to recover it from the storm, and it fell off the blocks. So that another longer rescue mission to try to get it out of the dry dock as well. But the background is that they go into a storm with 26 people, 26 men and 2 ladies on board. The wives of 2 of the crewmen are on there, and Tony the bulldog. And they get in and they lose control off the Keweenaw, and they drift up here, and they probably would have been found within a couple of minutes by the lighthouse at Gull Rock. But the lighthouse up there was one of the first ones they ever automated, so there were no people there. So they're stuck there now for 2 days as ice is coating over the Waldo, so you cannot get in or out of the wreck. And they're down to 2 cans of tomatoes and Tony the bulldog for dinner. That's all they had. So they're like, what are we going to do? Well, the good news is that the guys from Eagle River who tried to get out and came all the way back, frozen in their lifeboats, finally make it out there in the portage station, get a lift from the tug Hebert, which actually pulls them all the way out here, and they all meet at the same time. But these poor guys in Eagle River come out in this small boat, their big boat's not running, and as my friend here, Mark Rowe, tells you from the UP, it was pretty scary when they left for their first attempt to try to rescue these guys.
they were in the lighthouse, this family with the lightkeeper, and they said, "Better wire Washington, boys. Those guys ain't never coming back." You know, because they saw them go out. Well, they got out of here and made it about almost to Copper Harbor, but Tucker was afraid because of the ice buildup in that, and they had a hard time. I don't know, they said I read something, an excerpt that they had a hard time keeping the engine going. He was afraid for his crew, so he turned around and came back. And then they said when they made it to shore, the townspeople had to break the ice off their jackets and stuff to get them, you know. And I believe, well, it happened with maybe Tucker and Glaze, the boat. They had to break the ice off his hands from the steering wheel, you know, because it had built up so much.
Can you imagine that? Chipping them out of the lifeboat so they can get back in and make that trip again. Coming up on the stern here, and the amazing thing is one of the Coast Guard guys actually has a camera, so all the pictures you see of all the shipwrecks, the Turret Cape, they're the Turret Chief and the LC Waldo, and later on the city of Bangor, which was built in Bay City as well. All of these vessel pictures are taken by the Coast Guard rescue team, which we never see on the Great Lakes. And it's this guy right here, Glaza. And Glaza actually becomes the commandant of all the Great Lakes. So he works his way up to surfboat man number 1, eventually gets his own station, and then takes over in Chicago for all the Great Lakes. So this thing, it says it's wrecked out there, and they didn't think they could bring it off, and the favorite, Tug, actually gets it broken loose and puts that cement bottom in it and brings it in, and they rebuild it. And it sails the Great Lakes for another 30 years until they finally decide we have to scrap it. And the prices were better in Italy. So they tow it across the ocean, and before it gets to Portofino, it actually sinks. It goes into another storm, and here it is sitting in the Mediterranean Sea. And I have to tell you, I'm saving all my pop cans so I can go and dive this shipwreck. It starts in 60 feet of water right here and falls off into a deep water, 130, 160 feet back here. And there's many pieces, but to go and see a Bay City built freighter in the Mediterranean Sea would be absolutely cool. So any books you buy are going to go towards this quest that I have of going down there for sure. Incredible shipwreck though. This is Schuster, and I wish I had a really good outcome for Schuster. Schuster was the chief engineer, Schmock's dog on board the Marshall Butters. The Marshall Butters famous for its mill in Lance, and of course all the operations in Ludington. But by the time the 1916 Black Friday storm comes along, unfortunately in this big huge storm we actually have 4 ships that go down. One of them, the DL Filer, is actually famous for Ludington too, for the Filer name, but the captain is from here. His name's Madison. And his nephew, he had asked him, "Hey, would you just come along on this trip? I'll give you an extra bonus if you come along." And sadly, his nephew, everybody else died except for Madison. So think of the captain always being the one that always drowns on the ship when it goes down. In Black Friday 1916, 2 ships had only 2 captains survive. And everybody were lost on the Merida, which was actually built in Bay City as well. But this one, we're lucky because this is actually a photograph of the Butters sinking. Again, the engineer had a camera and took pictures of the boat when he was there. So they go into the storm. They're actually making their way through on what we call a lumber hooker or a rabbit, one of the smaller steamers that they would load right up. And this one was in pretty good shape. All of our lumber had been cut in this area. And remember, Bay City and Saginaw had all these mills. And so they start going up into Midland to cut trees. And this worked for a while until the Canadians caught on to us and said, well, we'd rather cut those in Canada. And they raised their tariffs. Does this sound familiar at all? They raised their tariffs so that we couldn't do that here. So this was Butters came out of here, and they were actually going to go down to the more lucrative Tonawanda. So they were coming down. They came through Detroit. They looked at the forecast. It looked safe. And they came out past the islands here and unfortunately realized they were sinking. So the captain told the guys, unload whatever you can on the deck. Start throwing everything in the water you can, and I'll start blowing the whistle. The winds were so strong they couldn't hear the whistle, but they saw the steam coming out of the whistle. And so when they looked at the other ships, 2 of them that came alongside, realized they were in trouble. And they pulled along, and they actually got all the crew off. So the engineer came over here and got on board the Billings and took all these pictures in the storm. The Billings dumping storm oil. This is how they thought they could calm down the waves, by dumping these oil barrels. Not good for the ecology, but at least it did have a different viscosity that would break down the waves till they brought the lifeboat on board. And that's how we got this picture. And then another freighter came along, the Hartwell, and actually was able to pick up the captain who had been pinned on board, but saved by one of his crewmen. And here you've seen it taking the final plunge. And look at this video on the bottom. Now, when I did my dive on this wreck, it was so bad you couldn't even see in front of you. I ran into the shipwreck with my mask like this before I saw it. So Jeff gave me some of his footage that's actually a little bit better. As we go across the engineering section and we're coming up on the triple expansion steam engine, you saw the plates that are down there, and for the most part, a lot of the stuff is here. But this one, when it went down, the mast, because the depth is very shallow in Lake Erie, the masts were sticking above the water. Here's the triple expansion steam engine reaching up towards the surface, which it's got to be probably 40 feet underwater, I think. So it's not a problem for other freighters, but I would think with a good wave dipping you down, it might be an issue for sure. This is another incredible photograph because this is an actual picture of all 17 passengers or crewmen that were saved from the Parker, and 2 dogs that were on board are right there. And this is the Westcott bringing them into shore at Grand Marais. And I say sport and he who shall not be named on here because for some reason back then, Black Dog was given a very offensive name. And I will not repeat what that name is, but we do know what the dog's name was. So A.A. Parker, the guy that the boat was named for, was famous in Detroit. I do have to tell you though, this is the Tajmu. He was not that tall. I love their caricatures that they would do. They'd actually put, because he was a banker and he had the Maritime Bank, they put that in one hand, and then they put his 2 boats here. Now the Tajmu was famous. You know, back then you would take these short excursions and it would be very difficult to go all the way up to Mackinac Island. So what they did was they went to Harson's Island in the river and bought up a big section and made their own little park area there. So it wasn't real fancy like Cedar Point and many of the other places like Boblo, but it was a great place to bring people, and thousands, tens of thousands of people actually went there for many years until the recession hit for sure, the Great Depression hit. But A.A. Parker managed to have several boats in his fleet, and then all of a sudden they had the Kasota that actually sank in the Detroit River. And it turns out that Falcon got pretty smart. He knew it was down only about 40 feet in the river, so he put these barrels alongside of it and filled them full of air and lifted the boat up. And you could tell right here too that some of the damage, they put this derrick on the top, but look at how this top section's missing. That's because once it sank, and only the cook was lost. Sadly, the lady cook could not get off the boat when one of the big passenger boats actually crashed into the boat in the river. Another ship, when it was sunk, ran into it and damaged the ship too. But the collision was the most, biggest damage. And look at what it looked like when it was at the shipyard. This is what the city of Detroit looked like when it crashed into that vessel. Actually, it might have been the city of Cleveland that hit them, but look at that. There's a guy for scale. And turns out the rebuild was so much that they said, we deserve to rename this vessel. We're not going to call it the Kasota. We're going to give it the A.A. Parker's name. And it sailed for many years and was lost in that. Unfortunately, I'll show you some pictures in a minute of what it looked like off Whitefish Point, found in the 1990s by the Shipwreck Society. So if you go through all the logbooks, and this is what I do on my off time, I'll go to Chicago and go through every logbook to try to find things that weren't in the newspaper. And throughout all of this, they don't mention the dogs or anything in the rescue. Only a newspaper in Chicago talks about the dogs. But they never mention in any of the logbooks that they picked up a lady cook too on board. Now typically it'll be almost like a police report. They'll say 5 men, 2 women. They'll give at least some detail. Some of these guys are so stranded up there, they write these incredible stories that could almost be printed. They're just so beautifully written. But in this one it was detailed enough about what it took to do it and who helped out, but nothing about Fred and Haley Wise who were on board here. And you only find out about who these people were in the tragic event that they were actually sailing on another vessel afterwards at Thanksgiving, and they were both killed, unfortunately, on the steamer Raleigh. So you see this great photo mosaic of the wreck that's in Lake Erie that took their lives. Sadly, they wrote a letter to their mom, to the grandmother of their kids, and said, "We'll be home shortly," and have the turkey on the table. And it was just absolutely, tragic. See parts of the boiler in the picture here as well. But both of them made it off of the Parker, but sadly were lost on the Raleigh. Here's what the A.A. Parker looks like, and this is what kind of preservation we get in Lake Superior. A.A. Parker and Detroit still painted on the stern of this vessel. It's incredible. No quagga mussels, no zebra mussels, so we get amazing visibility down there, and so lucky that none of the zebra mussels have actually coated many of the details that are down there that we can try to piece together the story. So are all the stories about dogs true? Well, I got to tell you, some of them didn't really hold water, if you'll forgive the pun. This one was one that just seemed like a fantastic story. The tragedy is that Chicora was all done for the season. They had taken all the mattresses, all the stuff off of the passengers' cabins, and all of a sudden they got a really good price on flour. So the train company said, if you go across the lake and pick up some flour from Milwaukee, we'll pay you handsomely. So Captain Steins grabs a skeleton crew, and he calls his buddy and says, listen, if you want to go to Milwaukee and come with us, you can do whatever you want. And the guy goes, I want to see a play in Milwaukee. He says, well, come on along. He goes, bring your shotgun. You can play some skeet off the back of the boat when we go out. So they go all the way across the lake, and he's shooting skeet off the back of the Chicora. They get back, and he sees the play, sends a telegraph back to tell us everything that he had done. And that morning, a big storm comes up. So from the main office, they start sending teletype from Michigan. Don't go, don't go. The storm is too bad, just stay in Milwaukee. But it was a half hour after they left. So this boat sails into this big storm. The Chicora vanishes. Not a single person is found from the shipwreck. And everybody, is mourning through both cities of people who were lost. And then it comes down to another story that comes out with a remarkable detail about a little dog. And this little tiny dog, you see this is a great close-up of what Chicora looked like, a pretty good-sized steamship. And the little dog is Frozen Terrier, and it says that he came up to a little hotel that is right over Solon Cutler's property right here, and they go through the whole thing. On Tuesday night, the dog was heard whining at the door of Solon Cutler, who conducts a roadhouse at Potawatomi Park. He's a snuff-colored Skye Terrier. He was covered with ice, and he connected the story to the Chicora and knew it had to be from there. The dog could not swim more than a quarter of a mile, so the wreck must be off of there. So all of this stuff is published. All the newspapers cover about this miracle dog. There's a group out of Chicago that has a freak show. They call it a dime show, and they have the lizard girl and the bearded woman and heavy-set people and stuff. And they go in and they said, we want to buy that miracle dog. We want that dog at any cost. So he starts calling around, and they call the hotel where Solon supposedly reported it, and Solon said, I never heard a thing about it. So he puts in the newspaper, Cutler denies the story. I received today a dispatch from Cole and Middleton in Chicago wanting to hire or buy the dog from the steamer Chicora. I wish to say there was no dog at my place as reported. I knew nothing of the story other than the rounds of the newspapers. Someone must have a very vivid imagination. I regret very much that someone would so wish to distort the truth. Now, the newspapers were also going crazy with all the people that didn't make it. They were sick. They didn't get on board the boat. So there were all these rescue stories. And that's what you see in the other newspapers are too. The story about Dog, the grizzled, the grizzled dog is all fake. This dog had been hanging around the Big Four depot on the docks. It says this dog should be added to the list of those who narrowly escaped going out on the ill-fated boat. So they're poking very sharply at all these stories that were happening there. So yeah, I don't think that dog ever existed, and we certainly didn't get him at the dime store for sure. This is S.R. Kirby, and Steve Kirby is actually a famous name on the Saginaw River. He built a lot of boats that came out of the bend in the river as you go around Gray Iron and head into Saginaw. That's where the shipyard was that Hoyt actually had, and so he built the Quick Step and the Magnet, a couple other boats that were pretty famous. In fact, the first locomotive for Pere Marquette for the depot that we were actually helping today clean up, that depot, the first train that came in, the Pollywog, actually was was brought in by the Quick Step that was built by Kirby. So Kirby stayed here till about 1872. He went to Wyandotte where he could build steel vessels, and there he and his son Frank started designing these incredible steamers that were very ingenious. In fact, this one that was named for Stephen, the SR Kirby, is a composite steamer. It's part wood and part steel, and the reason they did that was they wanted to keep it somewhat light because a lot of these ports needed to be dug out for these heavier boats. So if you had something that was composite, it wasn't as heavy and they could get into some of these shallower ports, which was a big deal for them. In 1916, they sailed into a massive storm that came off of the Keweenaw, and they were right next to another vessel, sadly, and the other vessel could not help them. And so they go into the water, 2 boats came around, and finally the Hartwell and the Utley were able to pick up the second mate and the fireman. And then you start to see all these other stories, like this is the logbook of how they found the mate's body on one of the tiny little islands up there. And then there's a couple of newspaper stories that say a little dog came ashore. And the dog's name was Tige, and everywhere I looked I see Tige, and I'm like, that is the strangest name for a dog. Does anybody know where Tige came from? Yeah. Buster Brown. It turns out if you search Tige, you'll find out that it's actually this guy, the winking bulldog, or whatever he is, and Buster Brown, and both full of mischief, apparently. There's also a story that comes out around that same time that there was a survivor that came out, and this guy was actually on board another vessel that was lost during World War I at the time when the Germans started sinking American ships, saying they were carrying supplies before we entered the war. Lusitania was lost, and a year later we saw the Leelanau go down, and he survived that. And they said he was on board, but I cannot find a single piece of evidence that he survived, other than a headline that says he's going back to work on the Great Lakes. So whether or not he survived, we don't know, but the dog, Tige, we hear from one report that he came ashore, and then he actually stayed at the life station all winter, and then came back to Detroit, where Gerardin, the captain who was lost, his wife welcomed the dog back with open arms. None of it can be true. There's nothing that was ever printed. There's nothing in the logbook about Tige, about how they might have wanted some food for the dog or how the dog did all winter. Nothing that I could find other than that newspaper story, and I've been through every logbook to try to find that out. They just found this vessel 2 years ago, and sure enough, it disintegrated on the bottom. And the question is, why is it just in tiny little pieces like this? And the answer is probably, first of all, it was loaded full of iron, and it was also built in a very unique way. Remember, Kirby had a special design for this. These are actually the ballast tanks. So when the vessel is not carrying cargo, the propeller is not low enough in the water. So they bring this water on board to lower the vessel down to allow your propeller and rudder to do their job. Look at how high these are. They're normally in the bottom of the ship. He kept them up top. Now, once that gets pushed underwater, if there's just air in there, those explode. So on the Fitzgerald, they launched the covers off and folded the covers in half. On this here, the covers would have blown off, but they were exploding. And I think they actually disintegrated the ship. Look at, there's no pieces that look like a boat in any of this. And here's another piece of the composite wood with the metal on the bottom. So we're still looking at that. 2 different groups. The Liason has been out there, and our group, the Society's been out there as well. Let me play a quick video about the Plymouth. And today when I came into town, I went by the Char House restaurant. The anchor for this boat used to sit out front there. And if anybody in the audience knows where Mr. Doherty might have brought it to, I don't know where it went to. And I would love to find out, because he was one of the guys that salvaged some of the equipment on this boat. Here's what happened.
Few ships have donated more tons of flour to Lake Huron than the propeller Albany, built for Western Transit at Wyandotte in 1884. Its first cargo was grain, and 3 years later, Captain Frank Williams was bringing flour through the Straits of Mackinac when he was caught in a blinding snowstorm. The Albany smashed onto Poe Reef at full speed, and despite 500 barrels of flour being tossed into the lake, the steamer wouldn't budge. Terms were discussed to bring in extra help and lighters to take the flour cargo, and the tug Major Dana tied up to the port side of the Albany to offload her. The barges took the cargo ashore, where over 200 barrels of flour and 21 40-gallon containers of lard were stolen. The entire cargo of the second barge also turned up missing, and the U.S. Marshals were called in. 500 barrels were found hidden in the woods. Captain Angus MacDonald took command of the Albany in the fall of 1888. That next season, he nearly lost the ship on Lake Michigan, turning around at Little Point Sable when a wave washed away his forward cabin. The crew reinforced the floor of the wheelhouse and made an 11-hour trip back to Chicago.
In 1893, Captain McDonald was making that same run to Buffalo when he encountered blinding fog off Michigan's Thumb. At 2 a.m., the Philadelphia slammed into the Albany, and the 24 members of the crew jumped into their lifeboats and rowed to the Philadelphia.
Captain McDonald believed his ship could be saved, so he asked Captain Huff to take his ship in tow. The two ships made only 30 minutes toward shore when the Albany started sinking. 230 barrels of flour and 75,000 bushels of oats went down with her. A half hour more and it was evident the Philadelphia wasn't going to make it. Now, with only 2 lifeboats and enough life belts for half the men, the crew were being lowered to the water. With the lifeboats filled, the captain and chief engineer's dogs had to be left on board.
Captain Huff lost more than just his dog when the Philadelphia went down. His chief engineer, Colin Leggett, had also lost a dog, and he and second mate Albert Hanna boarded the second lifeboat with the majority of the Albany's crew. And while they managed to lower the boat and get to the waterline, after a few shouts of encouragement from the captains in the other boat, they vanished into the fog. No one lived on lifeboat number 2, which was likely hit by either the Philadelphia, which had been left under power in hopes that it would make shallow water for an easier salvage, or they were hit by an unreported other vessel in the fog. But either way, many of the bodies that were recovered and brought here to Tawas had severe injuries to their heads, arms, and legs. Hanna was found wearing his pin from the Lake Pilots Aid Association, and inside his memo book he had $80 cash. Sadly, he was single, and all they knew was he was from Buffalo, and no one claimed his body. After a year, he was buried right here in Greenwood Cemetery. Another body had a scar on his hand, and it was believed he was a watchman named Williams. Tawas's coroner sent him to Saginaw, where Mrs. C.M. Williams was preparing a funeral. Williams was actually alive. He had left the Philadelphia and shipped out of Bay City on board the steam barge James Donaldson. He was in Ontonagon loading when the collision occurred and knew nothing until he returned home. The unidentified body was sent back here to Tawas.
Government inspectors looked into the collision and found no fault, largely due to the fact that no one steering or commanding the Philadelphia was alive to tell what happened. Captain Huff had been in his cabin until he felt the ship go into reverse to avoid the crash and was not held liable. Captain McDonald moved on to the steamer Hudson. He was lost in a gale on Lake Superior in 1901. Tragedy found Captain Huff 4 years later after he took a land-based job at the dock in Lackawanna, New York. Working on the deck of the steamer Luzon at 3:30 in the morning, he accidentally stepped into an open hatch, falling 20 feet into the hold. 43 years old, he had only been with the steel company for a year. Today, divers visit both wrecks in the Thumb Area Underwater Preserve. Nearly 3 miles apart, Philadelphia is largely intact, with its cargo of cook stoves still on the deck. The Albany is twisted into pieces, and rumors persist that barrels of flour were still being discovered in Lake Huron into the 1940s.
They said the flour was still good in the barrels that they found, that they could take the coating off of it, which I don't think I would have done, and do that. Here's the Dean Richmond. This is probably one of the most popular shipwrecks on the Great Lakes because it was rumored to have silver ore on board, one of the treasure ships that they, inaccurately depicted. And this one had a big story too of everybody died, and then all of a sudden a guy showed up on the beach and said, "No, I made it. My dog is tied up to the lifeboat. Let's go get him." And they get there and there's no lifeboat, there's no dog. They finally see another boat, but this guy vanishes, and it turns out there's 2 people that are trying to get whatever money they could. They'd go in and say, "Hey, I was on the shipwreck. Any chance you can float me some money so I can get back to my home?" And they were using these headlines that were coming out to actually get money from it. So they did find the shipwreck. They went through and realized that it only had ingots on board that were actually zinc ingots. These are used mostly for actually creating brass, so no real value. Some of the ingots came up. They couldn't pay for the expedition to raise them up and to actually salvage them, and they used them for steps in a motel in, I think in Canada, of all places. Here's a quick tour around this wreck, and it's interesting. There's the damage they did to get to the ingots, and also the ship flipped upside down. And if you look on the left-hand side, the propeller's gone. I haven't seen anything that said who salvaged that or where it went, but maybe they did get some money from that. Often these were made of brass, and they were at least worth something. But divers go and see this quite regularly now. It's upside down, but there's a lot of stuff to see. I'll leave you with this one. This is Suji. Suji was a Coast Guard dog and probably one of the biggest beer drinking dogs you'll ever meet. The Coasties tell me at the Cutter Wood Rush that he would go into the bars and they would take an ashtray and clean it out and fill it full of beer for him, and he could drink his beer that way. And he also chased all the ladies around the port too, so don't let that innocent face fool you. Well, it turns out they're watching a football game in 1975 when the Edmund Fitzgerald is missing. So Suji, who's named for a cleaning solution that's used on the boats to take away, the thick material, especially around when we had coal burning, the soot that would come up. The Suji was the cleaning solution that they'd use, or the mops that they would use to do that. Here he is sitting on the deck right here with the Wood Rush, bringing one of the tender boats in. And you actually see him here too, wearing his earphones. I don't think he was really rated for radio, but definitely had a job on board. I could not find what happened to him. Many of the crew had transferred off, and then finally found the newspaper report that he had died and was buried in the Sioux, or forgive me, in St. Ignace. So my hope is to find his grave, but none of the cemeteries know anything about it. There's a chance that he might actually be on the property where the Coast Guard is. That would make the most sense. It would have been an easier burial there, and it's just really hard to call him up and ask him, hey, is there a grave site there? But it turns out this guy was the captain going in, Jimmy Hobaugh. Did anybody go to our talk when Jimmy came to Bay City with me on the Edmund Fitzgerald? We had such an amazing time. He never wanted to talk. He probably did 7 or 8 lectures on the Fitzgerald, and then finally was done. But luckily for me, he was a Mason, and the Masons asked him to come back to your incredible facility here, and we actually did a talk, and it was amazing. But he had told me about this dog, and he told me how eerie it was to go through this big storm where they almost sank themselves, on this cutter, and the dog was right there with them.
When I went out in April, no, they weren't anywhere close, and it was just one night. It was like you anchored over my ship, and I'm going to slap you, because for the next 10 days it was just like a mirror, just like glass. Perfectly calm. And it was so calm that we had our dog on board. The dog didn't bark. People, it was like everything was muffled at night, even the generators running. Just an eerie feeling. It was you can get emotional about it, and you can get, if you believe in ghosts and so forth, you can imagine that.
It's incredible. His son actually became an astronaut and flew on 3 different shuttle missions, and now I think he flies for FedEx, or he's probably retired now. But the story goes, they found the ship, and of course we'll be doing a lot of these lectures. With the 50th anniversary of the sinking this year, I'm booked Duluth, everywhere around the Great Lakes. I just got back from Manitowoc. It's been very wonderful to talk about not only what I've learned about the shipwreck, but of course all the stuff that's in my brand new book called the Tattletale Sounds, and of course lots on the hatches, lots on the background, and I'll give you a quick tour on deck. What's remarkable about this, if you haven't seen my Fitz talk, this is the forecastle deck. That's supposed to be straight. That's the bend from when it hit the bottom. This is hatch number 1, and it folded in from the giant wave that hit the Anderson, then sped forward and crushed this in. And what's important to note is look at how deep it is into the cargo hold. If it went nose down, 26,000 tons of taconite should have come forward, including 9,000 that was in hold number 1. There's not a single pellet up here. I found no taconite behind hatch 8 where it's ripped on the bottom, but I found all the taconite that I saw after the shipwreck. So I say it broke apart on the surface, that it did not go down in one piece. And even at this rip right here, where the spar deck is actually ripped away from the side, this is the first scene I saw when I came up on the wreck. This is a crevasse that goes down into the ship. There's no taconite inside the tunnel. All this would be covered from the impact with the bottom. And of course, there's nothing even up here. You can't see any ripples, which you would see almost marble-sized little dimples in there from the millions of billions of pellets that are on board. Go across the side, you see it's buried into the hill. and it's all the way down until it's buried 17 feet in the mud where it probably hit bedrock, and all these plates are all busted up from hitting sideways into the side of the this big hill that's here. Buried way past the bow thrusters, and you just get around the corner and you can tell the nose is bent all the way over, so it hit with great force onto the bottom. This is a great aerial that Jim Clary painted from all of our work, and if you know, I came in this way, came up on the crack, came around here twice, then came out here and got lost in the back section here. We finally got up here, and I found hatches 2 and 3 right here. So these hatches here are way over there. It's another indication that it broke apart on the surface. This is the Delta dropping a plaque. This is before the bell was brought up, so no one had ever marked the grave sites. We put a plaque down there with the names of everybody that was on the ship, and then underneath it has the names of everybody on our expedition. So my name, Tom Knab from TV5's name, is on that plaque 550 feet down into Lake Superior. Lots of books. I think I have to run out the car and get more Howling Winds, and I will do that to make sure that we have copies today. Wheelsman covers all the big storms. Lake Fury, I don't think I have any of these Safe Ashores left, but there are a couple Fitzgeralds left. And of course, Tattletale Sounds is the big one that has all the Fitzgerald stuff, $20 up at the counter. It's always special to be here with this group, and to have a crowd like this, it really makes me feel wonderful to come back. This is a homecoming for us. We lived here over 20 years. We raised our kids in Bay City, Saginaw area, and absolutely are thrilled to come back and see our friends. We're in Wixom now because that's where the grandbabies are. That's where we've already colored Easter eggs, and we'll be ready to hide some of those tomorrow if the weather holds for us. Thank you for all you do. Remember, my friends here at the Marine Society, they've got a place you can put the donation. That is what helps them to make their ends meet as well, and to show some appreciation for not only the talks they do here, but this incredible museum right here. Thank you, guys.